So welcome back. This is going to be screencast number 1 for chapter 26, and in this screencast we are going to begin our discussion of reptiles. Now what we need to do is we need to understand that now we have a group of animals that have actually transitioned to life pretty much outside of water. Before we were talking about the amphibians, and we had talked about that they still have a very close connection to water, primarily because their skin is so incredibly thin it has to remain moist, and of course their eggs need to be laid in an aquatic environment because pretty much they don't have a shell, and so they have to have access to that moisture. But in this case, we're talking about a group of animals that are commonly known as the amniotes because this group of animals can actually lay its eggs on land. Now, a lot of times you'll talk about or speak about their eggs as being sort of like an amniotic pond. If you notice here, it says development of a shelled egg was going to free the reptilian groups to definitely exploit the land that they now inhabit. Extra embryonic membranes are going to be maintained, and they're going to be used both as a respiratory surface and as a storage compartment for various types of waste products. And in this case, the waste products are going to be primarily nitrogen-based. Now, as we talk about the characteristics of amniotes, and again, the amniotes are going to include the reptiles and also include the birds and the mammals, we can't get away from not talking about the specifics of that amniotic egg because, like I had said, it's really important in terms of how these animals have adapted to life on land. Now, when you talk about the amniotic egg, you're talking about an egg that actually contains 4 extra embryonic membranes. And down here towards the bottom, you can see all 4 of those membranes being represented. We have the amnion, we have the chorion right here, the allantois right here, and definitely have the yolk sac as our 4th one. Now the amnion is going to be the sac that actually encloses the embryo in what we would consider a fluid-filled space. And so that fluid-filled space is going to act to sort of protect and sort of provide a cushion for that growing embryo. Now the allantois, which is this membrane that you see right through here, this is going to be the membrane that's actually going to store those metabolic wastes that we had talked about in the previous slide. And the third membrane that we're going to look at is the chorion. Now the chorion is right about here, and so it's right outside of that allantois, and it's going to be used to surround their embryo and pretty much all the other extra embryonic membranes. It's going to lie right beneath the shell. It's going to be very highly vascularized, which means it's going to have a lot of circulatory function in terms of you'll see a lot of veins and arteries and stuff running through this particular membrane. It does have a respiratory surface, so it's going to be one that's actually going to allow gas exchange between the outside and the inside of that egg. Now the 4th membrane that we're going to look at is the yolk sac. And this is the one that most of us are very familiar with because the yolk sac is going to be primarily that membrane that's going to hold all of the nutrients that that growing embryo is going to use as it develops in the egg. So the amniotic egg is going to permit development not only of a larger embryo but also of a faster growing embryo. So it's going to provide better support and movement of oxygen than we've seen in the past, and it's also going to contain a shell that could be broken down to provide important calcium for growing skeletal structures within that embryo. Now all amniotes are going to lack the gilled larvae that we had seen back in the amphibians, and most of these animals will have some form of internal fertilization. So pretty much what we've done in this group of animals, we've eliminated the need for any type of aquatic environment when it comes down to reproduction. Now in this case, when copulation does take place, now we have transitioned over to a special structure called the penis, which is going to be used as the primary copulatory organ in these amniotes. Now another characteristic that we often note with the amniotes is the way that they actually respire. And what we do is we give that a special name. We call it rib ventilation of those lungs. Now we had looked at the lungs in the frogs that we had looked at in the previous chapter. So in this case we're still continuing with that idea that lungs are necessary to allow them to exchange gas between themselves and their environment. Now amniotes are going to draw air into the lungs in a special way. What they're going to do is they're going to expand that thoracic cavity, and so this area right through here is considered the thoracic cavity. And when it says expand, it's talking about basically bringing that thoracic cavity out. In other words, if you think about taking a breath, as you inhale, you bring air into your lungs. Well, what that does is it kind of expands that chest cavity. And what it's going to do next is it's actually going to use special muscles called costal muscles, which will actually allow the liver to be pulled kind of posterior in the animal's body. Now, amniotes are going to use something called a negative pressure gradient to draw in air. Now, what they mean by that is this. Basically, when you inhale, as we had said, that chest is going to expand. So you're going to take in a deep breath, the chest is going to go out, and at that time also, as the chest expands or goes out, you're going to notice the diaphragm down here towards the bottom is going to move this way. And when it does that, it basically allows more space for air to be taken in by that animal. Now, when you breathe in and then you exhale or breathe that air out, then of course the chest is going to contract, it's going to get a bit smaller, and that diaphragm is going to relax, which means it's going to move back up, kind of further up into that chest cavity. And as this happens, that's going to cause that air to be released from that animal. So we consider that a negative pressure gradient type of respiration. Now again, when you look at amniotes, you're talking about an animal that has a much thicker skin than you would find in the amphibians. And now we talk about animals that actually have probably a waterproof type of skin as well. So it's going to help to not only protect them from maybe moisture on the outside, but make sure that we keep the moisture on the inside as well. So the amniotic skin is going to be very thick in most cases. So if you've ever looked at a snake or a lizard, you notice they have a pretty thick skin. It tends to be a bit more keratinized and a little less, or actually quite a bit less, permeable to water. Now there's going to be a variety of structures composed of keratin that you're going to find in these animals. Of course, not only reptiles, of course, but we're also going to look at the other amniotes like the birds and the mammals. But in the reptiles in particular, you're going to see the scales that are going to be keratin-based. In mammals, you would be looking at the hair. In the birds, of course, you'd be looking at the feathers. And any claws that you would find in any of these groups is going to be, again, a projection from that skin, which is going to be primarily composed of that keratin material. So keratin is going to be used to protect the skin from physical trauma. So definitely prevent any damage from occurring to that skin. And the lipids themselves that you would find, the lipids would be those fats that you would find in that particular skin that you're looking at, is going to help to prevent water loss also. So very few amniotes are going to use their skin as a primary respiratory organ. Remember we had talked about the cutaneous respiration that we had noticed or seen in the frogs and other types of amphibians that we had discussed in chapter 25. But in this case, because the skin is so thick, you're not going to have that cutaneous respiration taking place in most cases because the keratin and the lipids are going to basically limit the exchange of gases between the animal and its outside environment. Now, the class Reptilia is going to include about 8,000 species, and whenever you use the term reptiles, at least in present day, typically you're going to be referring to a group of animals that actually includes the turtles, the lizards, the snakes, what we call the tuataras, and the crocodilians. Now, reptiles definitely have a much better developed lungs than we had seen with the amphibians. Reptile lungs have much more surface area than you would find in most amphibian lungs. Now, as we had said a bit earlier, respiration is going to occur primarily with the lungs that we've just mentioned, but occasionally you might find animals where the respiration process might be supplemented in the cloaca, believe it or not, or the pharynx of some aquatic turtles. And so this is that idea, again, coming into play of that cutaneous respiration that we had seen in the amphibians. So most of the time you're not going to see this type of respiration occur, but in some aquatic species you might actually see it happen. So this might occur in aquatic turtles and even some of your sea snakes. Now, as we said previously, reptiles have a very tough, dry, scaly skin, and it's going to offer protection against desiccation. And remember, desiccation basically means we want to make sure that that animal does not dry out, and definitely protect it from physical injury. Now, a lot of times the skin of a reptile will contain special cells called chromatophores, which of course are cells that have a special pigment that's going to give some of the reptiles we might look at some pretty amazing colors. And if you look over here on the right hand side, you can see a veiled chameleon. And this veiled chameleon is definitely made up of lots of different color varieties. Now, of course, chameleons are quite famous for being able to change their color or kind of blend in with their surroundings. And so those chromatophores can definitely be manipulated by certain reptiles. Now, the scales of non-avian reptiles are definitely going to be a little bit different depending on the type of reptile that you're looking at. If you look at a crocodile, the scales themselves will actually remain throughout life. So in this case, you're not going to have a group of animals that will actually shed its skin or shed those scales. In other reptiles, such as lizards and snakes, you're going to get the production of a new keratinized epidermis, and that epidermis is going to basically replace the old epidermis, which will be shed, very similar to what you see over here on the right with this snake. Turtles have something called scutes, and down here towards the bottom you can see an example of those scutes. And these are sort of plate-like modified scales. And sometimes if you go to the back of my room and you look at the aquarium with the turtles, you might see some of these scutes on the bottom of the aquarium. Now, crocodiles and many lizards are going to possess a special layer called an osteoderm, and these are going to be the bony plates that you might find located in the dermis right beneath the scales. So if you look down here towards the bottom, you can see the word osteoderm, and that would be this layer that you see right through here. And so you can see the scales right up here. So again, it's just kind of another protective layer for these animals from their environment. Now again, kind of thinking back to reproduction, when you're talking specifically about reptiles, the amniotic egg of these reptiles are all going to have a shell, of course. In most cases, they're going to have a calcium-based shell. So when they say impregnated with calcium, it's basically meaning that it's been inundated with the calcium. In other words, it's kind of been pushed into that shell. Turtles are going to have eggs with very rigid shells in most cases, and most of the other eggs that you would find with other reptiles are going to be somewhat leathery, and so they're going to be kind of flexible. So in some species of reptiles, you will notice that the embryo will actually develop in the reproductive tract of the female. And so over here on the right hand side you can see a snake that's giving birth to live young. So a lot of times the reproductive characteristics of these reptiles is going to vary depending on the type of reptile that we're looking at. When you look at the jaws of these reptiles, they definitely are very efficient when it comes down to crushing or gripping their prey, again depending on the type of reptile that we're looking at. They've definitely developed a much larger jaw muscle. And you know, if you think back to the fishes that we had looked at, they have a sort of a mechanical advantage over those fishes, which if you remember, when we looked at how those fishes actually feed, they had to swallow their food whole. And in fact, the only way they could actually get food into their mouth was sort of a sucking mechanism. In other words, when they opened up that operculum, or they drew that water in, it basically formed a suction type of process which would draw the food into their mouth. Now the tongue is going to be very muscular in a lot of reptiles, and now we have a tongue that's actually going to be used to sort of move that food around inside of the mouth and basically kind of improve the method of what we call mastication and swallowing in that reptile. To masticate something basically means to chew something, to make it much smaller so it's much more efficient or easier to swallow. Now the reptile circulatory system is a little bit different from what we had seen in the amphibians, and you're going to be able to recognize this down here towards the bottom. What you need to understand in this case is that we now have a circulatory system which is going to sort of basically kind of mix the blood between that oxygenated and deoxygenated blood that you would find in the animal's body. If you look over here on the left hand side, we have an example of an amphibian heart, kind of a combination of the entire circulatory system. We have the heart here, the lungs towards the top, and the body down here. You have to make sure you pay very close attention to the key down here towards the bottom. The red's going to represent the oxygenated blood. It's going to be coming from the lungs. Deoxygenated blood is going to be coming from the body. And what we consider a mixed type of blood is where you actually have the compartments of the heart kind of mixing that, what I would consider the good blood and the bad blood. When you talk about an amphibian, typically the blood from the lungs, which has been oxygenated, and the blood from the body, which is pretty much deficient in oxygen, is sort of mixing. And so when it goes back out to the body, either when it comes to the body here or it goes back out to the lungs, we get sort of this kind of purpley colored mixture. In other words, this is what we consider sort of a kind of oxygenated blood. Reptiles are a little bit better off because they have what we consider sort of a semi-divided heart. So if you notice, there's more of a separation between the deoxygenated and the oxygenated blood, but because it's kind of semi-divided, there's still a little bit of mixing that does occur right through here. When you talk about a fully divided heart, like an endotherm, which we would be considered one of those, you definitely have no mixing that's occurring between the oxygenated and deoxygenated blood because we have a very solid barrier between those two chambers. This is definitely a much more efficient system than you would see here, and this one here is much more efficient than you would have seen in the amphibians. Now, when it comes down to excretion, reptiles have definitely developed some very efficient strategies for making sure that they can conserve as much water as they possibly can, because a lot of times you'll find reptiles in a rather arid or dry environment. Now, when you think back to the amphibians, they secreted most of their metabolic waste as ammonia, and this was primarily in a liquid form, and oftentimes it would be secreted in the water. Now, all amniotes, and again, that includes the reptiles, the birds, and the mammals, have what we consider metanephric kidneys. So it's more of a typical kidney that you would think of. Now, reptiles cannot concentrate urine in their kidneys, and so that's what makes them definitely a little bit different from not only us, but their amphibian ancestors. The urinary bladder is going to receive the urine, but that urine is going to be undiluted, which means the water and a lot of the salts are going to be removed in that bladder. And so when they actually do void their urine or void that bladder, what you're going to notice is that oftentimes it's going to appear as a semi-solid type of mass, and that mass is going to be primarily uric acid. And you can see that right up here towards the top right-hand corner. Take a look in the snake cage about a week or two after I've fed it a rat or a mouse, and you're going to see these semi-solid masses in there. And usually, as I had said, there's going to be some solid waste there, but a lot of this white stuff that you see right here, that's going to be the uric acid. Now, in some special cases, for example, some of your marine iguanas, they can actually remove some of the salt that they have in their bodies by special salt glands that are found near the nose, the eyes, or the tongue. And so what they typically will do is they will basically just kind of sneeze, and when they sneeze, a lot of the liquid that comes out is going to be inundated with that salt. So it's kind of an additional way to be able to remove the salt from their body. Now, the nervous system of reptiles is definitely more complex than we saw with the amphibians. The brain of these reptiles is going to be very small compared to the brain of other amniotes, so we're talking about the birds or the mammals. However, the cerebrum of all amniotes is going to be relatively enlarged. So we're going to start seeing a sort of a progression or a change in the way that this brain is represented. This cerebrum that's basically become a little bit bigger is going to correlate with the integration of sensory information and muscle control during locomotion. So what that basically means is that now we have animals that have more of an ability to react. I don't quite want to use the word think yet, but they have ability to sort of judge what's going on in their environment and make decisions on what they need to do. And of course, in order to do that, you have to have very good muscle control, because a lot of times that's going to involve maybe a change in the way that you're kind of making your way through that environment. So it's going to affect the locomotion of that animal. Now, a lot of reptiles have very good vision, and snakes and lizards are going to have what we would consider a very highly sensitive sense of smell, and they use this to find prey, and a lot of times they'll use this in reproduction as well to find mates. Now, in some of the snakes we're going to look at, we're going to mention something called a Jacobson's organ. Now, this particular organ is going to sort of assist the snake when it comes down to olfaction, or that sense of smell. And oftentimes this is going to be kind of embedded in the roof of the mouth of the animal. And down here towards the lower right, you can see an example of this Jacobson's organ. Oftentimes what you'll notice about some snakes is that they will actually use their tongue to kind of smell the environment. So as they kind of stick that tongue out, they'll bring it back in, and they'll bring in the chemicals or the molecules that they've picked up in their environment, and they'll kind of put those chemicals or those molecules on this Jacobson's organ, and it kind of allows that animal to be able to sense what's going on in that environment. So again, it's going to help that animal maybe in terms of finding prey, and maybe again, as we had said, maybe when it comes down to finding a mate. Alright, so that's going to finish up our very first screencast for Chapter 26. As I had said before, please again make sure that you are completing your screencast notes, because we are moving very quickly in class. So please make sure you have these completed before you come to class.